My family spent the entire reunion mocking me as the failure who couldn't even afford decent clothes, until my sister's CEO walked over and said 5 words that made everyone's jaws drop to the floor. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn of Riverside Country Club as former Army medic Dr. Elena Rodriguez pulled her modest Honda Civic into the guest parking area. She sat for a moment, watching her extended family through the windshield, cousins in designer suits, aunts dripping with jewelry, uncles comparing their luxury cars like trophies. The annual Rodriguez family reunion was always held at the most expensive venue someone could book, and this year her sister Carmen had outdone herself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Elena smoothed her simple black dress, the nicest thing in her closet, and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. After 8 years in the Army, including 3 tours as a combat medic in Iraq and Afghanistan, she'd grown comfortable with function over fashion. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, her makeup minimal, her jewelry non-existent except for the small cross necklace her grandmother had given her before she deployed. At 34, Elena looked tired. The past 2 years since her discharge had been a whirlwind of medical school applications, certification programs, and 16-hour shifts at the Denver VA Medical Center, where she worked as a physician assistant. She lived in a tiny studio apartment in a rough neighborhood, drove a car with 180,000 miles on it, and hadn't bought new clothes in months. Her work uniform consisted of scrubs and comfortable shoes, hardly the power suits and designer heels her cousins wore to their corporate jobs. What made it worse was that Elena had once been the family's golden child, valedictorian of her high school, full scholarship to Stanford, pre-med track with a 4.0 GPA. Everyone expected her to become a wealthy surgeon like her father, or a successful businesswoman like her sister Carmen, who now ran a multi-million-dollar consulting firm. Instead, Elena had shocked everyone by dropping out of Stanford in her junior year to enlist in the Army after her family had never forgiven her for throwing away her potential. The years of military service had changed her. She'd held dying soldiers in her arms, performed emergency surgery in field hospitals under rocket fire, and learned the value of things money couldn't buy. But to her family, she was just the cousin who'd wasted 8 years playing soldier and was now struggling to catch up in the real world. They saw her old car, her modest apartment, her bargain store clothes, and assumed she was barely scraping by. Elena stepped out of her Honda, conscious of how it looked next to the BMWs, Mercedes and Teslas that filled the parking lot. She could already hear the conversation starting. Poor Elena, still trying to figure out her life at 34. Remember when we thought she'd be the successful one? Such a shame she threw away her education for the military. As she walked toward the country club's marble entrance, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it quickly, an update from her financial advisor about quarterly earnings from her various investments. The number on the screen was larger than most of her relatives' annual salaries, but Elena simply smiled and slipped the phone back into her purse. They would never suspect the family failure walking through those doors was actually worth more than all of them combined. What they didn't know was that Elena's military experience had led her down a path none of them could have imagined. Her medical expertise, combined with connections she'd made overseas, had opened doors to opportunities that had quietly made her one of the youngest billionaires in the country. But she lived modestly, invested wisely, and used her wealth primarily for veteran causes and medical research. To her family, she was still just the disappointment who'd chosen service over success. Elena paused at the country club's entrance, her hand resting on the heavy brass door handle as memories flooded back. She remembered the last family reunion 3 years ago, when her cousin Miguel had publicly announced his promotion to regional sales manager like he'd just been elected president. Her Aunt Rosa had spent 20 minutes showing off photos of her new beach house in Malibu, while Uncle Eduardo bragged about his son's acceptance to Harvard Business School, with a full ride, he emphasized, as if Elena's own full scholarship to Stanford had been forgotten. That night, Elena had sat quietly in the corner, still wearing her dress blues from a military ceremony she'd attended earlier that day. She'd been honored for her work establishing a field hospital in Afghanistan that had saved over 200 lives, But none of her family had asked about the medals on her chest. Instead, her cousin Sophia had whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Poor Elena, still playing dress-up soldier at 31. When is she going to get a real job? The truth was, Elena had already started building her empire by then. During her final deployment, she'd partnered with Dr. James Mitchell, a former Army surgeon who'd developed revolutionary medical technologies for battlefield use. Together, they'd founded MedTech Solutions, initially focusing on portable surgical equipment for combat zones. Elena had invested her entire military savings, $50,000, into the venture, while Dr. Mitchell contributed his patents and expertise. What started as a small company serving military contracts had exploded when they adapted their technology for civilian emergency medicine. Their portable cardiac monitors, compact surgical suites, and rapid response medical kits had revolutionized emergency care worldwide. Hospitals from New York to Tokyo were lining up to buy their equipment. Elena's initial $50,000 investment had multiplied 1,000-fold in just 2 years, but Elena had learned to be strategic. Instead of flaunting her success, she'd quietly diversified her investments, purchasing shares in promising startups, funding medical research, and establishing charitable foundations for wounded veterans. Her military experience had taught her the value of operational security. Never reveal your true capabilities until absolutely necessary. She'd also maintained her modest lifestyle intention. The studio apartment kept her grounded and reminded her of the soldiers she'd served with who'd returned home to struggle with housing and healthcare. Her work at the VA wasn't about the money. She donated her entire salary back to veteran programs, but about staying connected to the community that had shaped her. Every day, she treated veterans who'd lost limbs, suffered PTSD, or faced homelessness, and their struggles kept her focused on what truly mattered. Elena's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from her business partner. Emirates Airlines just signed the $500 contract for our new aircraft medical systems. Congrats, partner. You're now officially worth $2.3 billion. Elena smiled slightly and deleted the message. In a few hours, her sister Carmen would likely spend 10 minutes bragging about landing a $5 million consulting contract with a local tech company, having no idea that Elena had just closed a deal worth 100 times more. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her family measured success by external appearances: the car you drove, the house you owned, the clothes you wore. They saw her Honda Civic and assumed failure, never suspecting that she could buy the entire country club without checking her bank balance. They mocked her simple black dress while she owned a company that had just revolutionized emergency medicine for the entire aviation industry. Elena took a deep breath and pushed open the door. She could hear the familiar sounds of her family's gathering, loud conversations about stock portfolios, vacation homes, and business deals. In a few hours, she'd face the same routine: polite questions about her little job at the Veterans Hospital, concerned comments about her simple lifestyle, and subtle suggestions that maybe it wasn't too late to go back to school and make something of herself. What none of them knew was that tonight would be different. Tonight, her secret would finally come out in the most unexpected way possible. Elena stepped into the opulent ballroom of Riverside Country Club, immediately noticing details that escaped most people's attention. Years of military training had honed her observational skills to a razor's edge. She automatically cataloged the room's layout, emergency exits, potential choke points, sight lines, and security cameras. More importantly, she assessed the business landscape spread before her like a battlefield commander surveying terrain. Her cousin Roberto was holding court near the bar, gesticulating wildly as he described his new food truck franchise. Elena caught fragments of his pitch. "We're projecting 15% growth annually, targeting 3 new locations by next year." She almost smiled. Last month, her investment team had quietly acquired a controlling stake in a restaurant technology company that would likely make Roberto's entire franchise obsolete within 2 years. But she kept her expression neutral, just another family member listening to business talk she supposedly couldn't understand. Across the room, her brother-in-law Marcus was showing off photos of his new Tesla Model S, proudly announcing the $120,000 price tag to anyone within earshot. Elena remembered the email she'd received that morning from her investment advisor about Tesla stock. She owned enough shares that Marcus's car payment was essentially funded by her quarterly dividends. Again, she said nothing, simply nodding politely when he caught her eye. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena, there you are, her sister Carmen approached with the kind of smile that meant trouble. At 36, Carmen was everything their parents had wanted in a daughter. MBA from Wharton, successful consulting firm, husband, who was a federal judge, 2 kids and private school. She wore a designer cocktail dress that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent, her jewelry sparkling under the chandeliers. I was just telling the Hendersons about your situation, Carmen continued, her voice dripping with false concern. How you're doing such important work at the Veterans Hospital. It's really admirable how you're helping those poor people. Elena recognized the subtext immediately. Carmen was positioning her as the family charity case, the well-meaning but financially struggling relative who'd chosen service over success. It was a familiar dynamic, one that had played out at every family gathering since Elena's discharge. Carmen got to look magnanimous and socially conscious by praising Elena's sacrifice, while simultaneously reinforcing her own superior position. The work is rewarding, Elena replied simply, not taking the bait. She'd learned long ago that defending herself only made things worse. Better to let them maintain their assumptions while she observed and learned. Each family gathering was like a reconnaissance mission, gathering intelligence about their businesses, investments, and vulnerabilities. I'm sure it is, Carmen said, her tone suggesting anything but sincerity. Though I do worry about your future. Have you given any thought to what you'll do when you're ready for something more substantial? I mean, you can't work at a government hospital forever. Elena almost laughed. If Carmen only knew that Elena's government hospital work was supplemented by board positions on 3 major medical technology companies, advisory roles with 2 Pentagon contractors, and consulting agreements with international humanitarian organizations. Last week alone, she'd participated in conference calls that would reshape emergency medicine protocols across 4 continents, but her military training had taught her the value of operational security and strategic patience. Never reveal your capabilities until the moment demands it. Let the enemy underestimate you, while you gather information, and wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. I'm exploring options, Elena said vaguely, watching as Carmen's expression shifted to what she probably thought was sympathetic understanding. Well, when you're ready to get serious about your career, I have some contacts in healthcare administration. Nothing glamorous, but stable work with decent benefits, better than what you're doing now anyway. Elena nodded thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering Carmen's offer to help her find an entry-level administrative job. In reality, she was mentally calculating whether Carmen's entire consulting firm, which Carmen had been bragging about all evening, was worth more or less than the tip. Elena had left at her last business dinner in Dubai. The answer would have shocked everyone in the room. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted palpably when Elena's uncle Fernando made his grand entrance. At 58, Fernando Rodriguez was the undisputed patriarch of the family's success narrative, a real estate mogul who owned a dozen commercial properties across Colorado and never let anyone forget it. He swept into the room wearing a custom Italian suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, his gold Rolex catching the light as he gestured expansively to the small entourage that always seemed to follow him. Behind Fernando came his wife Isabella, dripping in diamonds and carrying a Hermes bag that Elena recognized as costing around $15,000. Their twin sons, Diego and Pablo, both in their late 20s, flanked them like bodyguards. Diego worked as a junior partner at Fernando's real estate firm, while Pablo had recently started his own cryptocurrency investment company, with Fernando's backing. Both sons had inherited their father's arrogance along with his money. Elena watched from across the room as the family gravitational field shifted toward Fernando. Conversations paused as relatives positioned themselves for his attention. Uncle Eduardo rushed over to shake his hand, while cousin Miguel practically jogged across the room to join the growing circle. It was a familiar dance, the family's alpha displaying his dominance, while the others competed for his approval and validation. Fernando's eyes swept the room until they landed on Elena, Even from 30 feet away, she could see his expression change from jovial host to predatory assessor. He whispered something to Isabella, who turned to look at Elena with poorly concealed disdain. Diego nudged Pablo and both young men smirked in Elena's direction. The pack had identified their target. Well, well, Fernando announced loudly enough for half the room to hear. If it isn't our little soldier girl. Elena, come over here. We were just discussing real business, but I suppose you could use the education. The invitation was clearly a command, delivered with the tone of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Elena recognized the tactical situation immediately. Fernando was establishing dominance by publicly summoning her, setting up a scenario where refusing would look disrespectful while complying would put her in a subordinate position. It was a classic power play, the kind she'd seen countless times in military hierarchies and boardrooms. As Elena walked toward the group, she caught fragments of the conversation Fernando had been leading. Something about a $2.3 million commercial property deal he'd just closed, expansion plans for his real estate empire, and his son's brilliant investment strategies. The numbers being thrown around were meant to impress and to establish a financial hierarchy with Fernando at the top. Elena, Fernando continued as she approached, his voice carrying that particular mix of condescension and false familiarity that successful men often used with family members they considered beneath them. We were just talking about real estate opportunities in Denver. I don't suppose you've given any thought to building wealth through property investment, though I understand your current situation might make that challenging. Isabella tittered softly, a sound like breaking glass. Fernando, don't be cruel. I'm sure Elena is doing her best with what she has. Not everyone can be blessed with business acumen. Diego stepped forward, his expensive cologne preceding him like a warning. Actually, Uncle Fernando, I heard Elena's still renting some tiny apartment downtown. Can you imagine? At her age, he shook his head with exaggerated sympathy. I mean, I bought my first investment property when I was 25. But I guess everyone moves at their own pace. Pablo chimed in with the casual cruelty that only came from a lifetime of privilege. Maybe we should give her some advice. I made 6 figures last year, just on crypto trades. Elena, you should really consider getting into digital assets. Though you'd need some capital to start with. He trailed off meaningfully, as if her lack of investment funds was a personal failing rather than a choice. Elena stood perfectly still, her military training helping her maintain composure while her mind automatically cataloged the group dynamics. Fernando was the alpha, using public humiliation to reinforce his status. Isabella provided social validation for the attack. Diego and Pablo were the enforcers, delivering the actual insults while their father maintained plausible deniability. It was a coordinated assault disguised as family concern, and Elena could see that other relatives were starting to gather around to watch the show. The circle around Fernando had grown larger, with cousins, aunts, and uncles forming an audience for what was clearly becoming the evening's entertainment. Elena found herself at the center of a social coliseum, with Fernando as the emperor deciding her fate. She recognized the setup immediately. This wasn't just casual family ribbing. This was a deliberate public humiliation designed to reinforce the family's pecking order. You know, Elena, Fernando continued, swirling his glass of top-shelf whiskey, I've been thinking about your situation. It's not too late to turn things around. You're what? 34, still young enough to start building something meaningful. His tone was that of a benevolent ruler offering mercy to a defeated enemy. Elena kept her expression neutral, but her military-trained mind was already 3 moves ahead. She could see exactly how this would play out. Fernando would offer her some menial position in his company, the family would applaud his generosity, and she'd be expected to show grateful humility. It was psychological warfare disguised as family bonding. I actually have an opening at my firm, Fernando announced, pausing for dramatic effect. Nothing fancy, mind you. Administrative assistant, maybe some basic property management tasks. The pay wouldn't be much, probably around $35,000 to start, but it would give you some real business experience. What do you say? A murmur of approval rippled through the gathered relatives. Aunt Rosa clapped her hands together softly. Oh, Fernando. How generous. Elena, you should really consider this opportunity. Elena almost smiled at the beautiful irony. Fernando was offering her an entry-level position that paid less than what she typically donated to charity in a single month. Last week, she'd written a check for $100,000 to fund a new PTSD treatment program at the VA, more than triple Fernando's generous opportunity. But instead of revealing this, Elena simply nodded thoughtfully. "That's very kind of you to think of me, Uncle Fernando." Diego stepped closer, emboldened by his father's performance. "Honestly, Elena, you should jump at this. Do you have any idea how hard it is to break into real estate without connections? Dad's basically handing you a career on a silver platter." Pablo nodded enthusiastically. "And once you get some experience, maybe you could start investing, though you'd need to save up for a while first." "What are you making at that hospital?" "Like $40,000. It'll take you years to build up enough capital for even a small investment." Elena let them continue, each word adding another layer to the mounting irony. Pablo was lecturing her about building capital while she owned enough real estate investment trusts to buy his father's entire company portfolio. Diego was explaining the difficulty of breaking into real estate to someone who'd recently been approached by 3 different countries to help finance their infrastructure development project. "The important thing," Isabella added with the air of someone delivering profound wisdom, "is that you start somewhere, even if it means swallowing your pride and accepting that you're behind where you should be at your age. There's no shame in starting over." Carmen, never one to miss an opportunity to appear magnanimous, placed a patronizing hand on Elena's shoulder. "We're all family here, Elena. We want to see you succeed, but success requires making smart choices, not romantic gestures like joining the military." The gathered relatives nodded in agreement, their faces showing a mixture of pity and superiority. Elena could practically hear their thoughts. "Poor Elena, finally getting the help she needs. Maybe now she'll learn what real success looks like." Uncle Eduardo chimed in with his own wisdom. "The military is fine for young people who don't know what they want to do with their lives, but at some point, you have to grow up and focus on building real wealth. Fernando's offering you a chance to learn from the best." Elena stood quietly in the center of the circle, letting their words wash over her like rain off a steel roof. Each patronizing comment, each offer of help, each piece of unsolicited advice about building wealth and making smart choices. It all added fuel to a fire that was slowly building inside her chest. What they didn't realize was that Elena wasn't being generous by listening to their advice. She was conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about their true nature and motivations. And what she was learning was that her family's success had made them cruel, their wealth had made them arrogant, and their assumptions about her had made them dangerously overconfident. The evening air on the country club's terrace had grown cooler, but the heat of social warfare was just beginning to intensify. Fernando, emboldened by the family's enthusiastic response to his generous offer, decided to press his advantage. He gestured grandly toward the sweeping view of Denver's skyline, where the lights of his various commercial properties twinkled like stars in his personal constellation. "You see those buildings out there, Elena?" Fernando said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who believed his own mythology. "3 of them are mine. That office complex on 5th Street. Bought it for $1.2 million. Now it's worth $4.8 million. The retail center on Colfax. Picked it up during the recession for pennies on the dollar. That's what real business looks like, turning opportunities into empires." Elena followed his gaze, easily identifying the buildings he was pointing to. What Fernando didn't know was that her investment portfolio included shares in the construction company that had built 2 of those properties, the management firm that maintained them, and the tech startup that was revolutionizing how commercial real estate operated. She'd unknowingly been profiting from Fernando's empire for the past 18 months. Diego moved to stand beside his father, clearly having rehearsed this performance. "Dad's taught me everything I know about reading markets and timing investment. Last month alone, I closed 3 deals worth over $800,000 combined. The secret is knowing when to be aggressive and when to be patient." Elena nodded politely while mentally calculating that Diego's entire year's worth of deals was less than what she'd made in dividend payments during the previous week. But she maintained her interested expression, letting Diego interpret her silence as awe rather than amusement. "The thing is," Pablo added, stepping into the family spotlight, "real wealth isn't about having a steady job, it's about making your money work for you. My crypto portfolio has grown 300. Elena, you really need to understand that working for someone else, especially the government, is never going to make you financially independent." Isabella nodded sagely, her diamond earrings catching the terrace lights. "Pablo's absolutely right. At your age, Elena, you should be thinking about building passive income streams. The problem with military people is they're trained to follow orders, not to think entrepreneurially." The insult was delivered with a smile, but Elena caught the steel beneath Isabella's polished exterior. This wasn't just financial advice, it was a deliberate attack on Elena's intelligence and capability. The family was establishing a narrative where Elena's military service hadn't just been a career mistake, but evidence of her fundamental inability to think strategically about money and success. Carmen, never one to be outdone in dispensing wisdom, moved closer to the group. "I've been thinking about Elena's situation too. The problem isn't just the career gap, it's the mindset. Military culture teaches people to be satisfied with basic needs being met, but in the real world, you have to be hungry, aggressive, willing to take risks." "Exactly," Fernando agreed, warming to the theme. "Elena, I don't think you understand how far behind you really are. Look around this room, everyone here has been building wealth, making connections, establishing themselves in their industries while you were, what? Playing medic in the desert." The gathered relatives laughed appreciatively at Fernando's. Elena noticed how quickly they'd transformed from family members offering support to an audience enjoying a performance at her expense. Uncle Eduardo was literally smirking. Cousin Miguel had his phone out, probably texting someone about the entertainment. But Fernando wasn't finished. He was clearly enjoying his role as the family patriarch, delivering hard truths to a wayward relative. "The harsh reality, Elena, is that you've wasted your most productive year." While Diego was learning business fundamentals and Pablo was developing investment instincts, you were following orders and treating bullet wounds. "Those aren't transferable skills in the civilian economy," Diego nodded enthusiastically. "That's why Dad's offer is so generous. Most companies wouldn't even consider hiring someone with your background. No offense, but what does a military medic know about property values, market analysis, or client relations?" Elena felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger, exactly, but a crystalline clarity about what was happening. They weren't just offering her a job or giving her advice, they were systematically dismantling her credibility, her intelligence, and her worth as a human being. It was a coordinated assault designed to establish their superiority while reducing her to the role of grateful charity case. What made it particularly cruel was how they'd weaponized family loyalty. Every insult was wrapped in concern, every attack disguised as helpful advice. They were destroying her dignity while positioning themselves as the caring relatives, trying to save her from her own poor choices. Elena glanced around the circle of faces, Fernando's smug satisfaction, Isabella's barely concealed contempt, Diego and Pablo's entitled arrogance, Carmen's patronizing concern. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself to imagine their expressions when they learned the truth. When they discovered that the family failure they were lecturing about business success was actually worth more than all of them combined. The confrontation was drawing attention from across the ballroom. Elena noticed other family members gravitating toward their group, sensing drama in the air like sharks detecting blood in the water. What had started as a private humiliation was evolving into a public spectacle, exactly as Fernando had intended. The country club's elegant ballroom was transforming into an arena, with Elena positioned as the evening sacrifice. Carmen, recognizing an opportunity to demonstrate her own importance, stepped forward to address the growing audience. "Everyone," Fernando was just explaining some exciting opportunities to Elena. "You know how we've all been worried about her situation." The pause before situation was perfectly calculated, loaded with implications about Elena's supposed failures. Aunt Rosa moved closer, her eyes bright with the cruel excitement that came from watching someone else's downfall. "Oh my, what kind of opportunities?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew this was more about humiliation than genuine help. Uncle Eduardo, emboldened by the crowd's energy, decided to join the performance. Elena's always been too proud to ask for help. Remember when she turned down that internship at my accounting firm 15 years ago? Said she had other plans. He made air quotes around the phrase, triggering a ripple of knowing laughter from the assembled relatives. Elena recognized the tactical shift immediately. They were no longer just attacking her current situation, they were rewriting history, painting her entire adult life as a series of poor decisions and missed opportunities. It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, designed to isolate her completely while reinforcing their collective superiority. "That's right," Isabella chimed in, her voice carrying across the growing circle. "Elena's always thought she knew better than the rest of us. Military service, working at that place with all those damaged veterans. Such a waste of potential." The disdain in her voice when she mentioned Elena's work with veterans was particularly cutting. Fernando sensed the crowd's energy and decided to escalate further. "The truth is, Elena never understood what real success looks like. While the rest of us were building careers, she was playing soldier. Now she's 34 with nothing to show for it, except some participation trophies and a job that barely pays the bill." The gathered family members murmured in agreement, their faces showing a mixture of pity and superiority that Elena found more offensive than outright hostility. They were enjoying this, feeding off each other's energy as they systematically destroyed her reputation and dignity. Diego, drunk on the crowd's attention, decided to share an anecdote. "I remember when Elena came back from her first deployment. She kept talking about serving her country and making a difference. We all tried to explain that idealism doesn't pay the bills, but she wouldn't listen. Look where that got her." Pablo nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly, and now she's probably drowning in student loans, trying to figure out what to do with her life at an age when most of us have already established ourselves. It's actually pretty sad when you think about it." Elena stood in the center of the expanding circle, watching as her family members competed to deliver the most cutting observations about her life choices. Each comment was designed to reinforce the narrative they'd constructed. Elena is the family disappointment, who'd rejected sound advice and was now paying the price for her stubborn idealism. Carmen, always eager to position herself as the voice of reason, addressed the crowd with the air of someone delivering profound wisdom. "The thing is, we all tried to warn Elena, but she was always so convinced she knew better. Military service, working with veterans, living in that tiny apartment, it's like she's determined to struggle." "Well," Fernando announced with the gravitas of a judge delivering a verdict, "I've offered her a position at my company. Entry level, of course, but it would give her a chance to finally start building something real. The question is whether she's ready to admit her mistakes and accept help from people who actually understand how the world works." The circle had grown to include nearly 30 family members, all focused on Elena like spectators at a gladiator match. She could see the anticipation in their faces. They were waiting for her response, expecting either grateful acceptance of Fernando's generosity or defensive protests that would only provide more entertainment. Elena's military training had taught her to assess terrain in tactical situations, and what she saw now was a carefully orchestrated ambush. They had used the family gathering, the public setting and social pressure to create a scenario where any response she gave would be wrong. Accept Fernando's offer and she'd be admitting to all their accusations. Defend herself and she'd look defensive and ungrateful. But as Elena looked around the circle of expectant faces, family members who had known her since childhood, who should have been celebrating her service and sacrifice, she felt something crystallize inside her. They had made a fundamental error in their tactical assessment. They assumed they knew everything about her current situation, but they were operating with catastrophically incomplete intelligence. In a few hours, one person would walk into this room who would detonate their entire narrative, like a precision-guided missile. And when that happened, Elena was going to enjoy watching their smug expressions crumble into shock, embarrassment, and the dawning realization that they had just humiliated themselves in the most spectacular way possible. The family circle had tightened around Elena like a noose, and Fernando was clearly savoring every moment of his performance. He checked his gold Rolex with theatrical precision, as if Elena's response was keeping him from more important matters. The gesture was calculated to reinforce his position as the busy, successful patriarch whose time was valuable, unlike Elena's, which apparently had no worth at all. "You know what I think the real problem is?" Fernando announced to the captivated audience, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. Elena's never learned to accept reality. She's been living in a fantasy world where good intentions matter more than results, where serving others is somehow more valuable than building wealth. Isabella nodded approvingly, her diamond necklace catching the ballroom's crystal chandelier light. "Fernando's absolutely right. It's actually quite sad how some people convince themselves that being poor is noble. Elena, darling, there's nothing virtuous about struggling financially when your family is willing to help you succeed." The psychological blade was expertly wielded, positioning Elena's supposed poverty as both a character flaw and a choice she was stubbornly making despite their generous offers of salvation. Elena recognized the technique immediately. It was the same kind of manipulation she'd witnessed in hostile interrogations overseas, designed to break down the target's sense of self-worth and reality. Carmen stepped forward, her voice dripping with false concern that had been perfected through years of corporate politics. "Elena, I think what everyone's trying to say is that we love you, but love sometimes means having difficult conversations about uncomfortable truth. You can't keep pretending that your choices haven't led you to this point." Diego, emboldened by his stepmother's psychological assault, decided to twist the knife deeper. "The thing is, Elena, we've all been talking about you. Not in a mean way," he added quickly, though his smirk suggested otherwise, "but we're worried, really worried. You're living like someone half your age, working a job that goes nowhere, driving a car that should have been scrapped years ago." Pablo nodded enthusiastically, his cryptocurrency success having apparently qualified him as an expert on life planning. "Exactly. And the clock's ticking. Every year you waste is another year you'll never get back. At 34, you should be thinking about retirement planning, about building equity, about establishing yourself professionally. Instead, you're essentially starting from zero." Elena stood perfectly still, letting their words wash over her like acid rain on steel armor. Each comment was designed to chip away at her confidence, to make her question every decision she'd ever made. They were painting a picture of a woman so deluded about her own life that she couldn't see the disaster unfolding around her. Uncle Eduardo, sensing the mood of the crowd, decided to share his own wisdom. "You know, Elena, when I was your age, I already owned 2 businesses and a house, but I made smart choices, took calculated risks, listened to people who knew more than I did. That's the difference between success and—" He gestured vaguely in Elena's direction, letting the implication hang in the air like a toxic cloud. The gathered relatives murmured in agreement, their faces showing the satisfied expressions of people witnessing justice being served. In their minds, Elena was finally receiving the wake-up call she desperately needed, delivered by family members who cared enough to tell her the hard truths. Aunt Rosa, who had been silent up to this point, decided to deliver what she clearly thought would be the final blow. "Elena, sweetheart, I think what everyone's trying to say is that it's time to grow up. Military service was a nice adventure, and helping veterans is certainly charitable work, but real life requires real solutions. You can't keep living like a college student forever." Fernando smiled with the satisfaction of a general watching his strategy unfold perfectly. "Exactly, and that's why my offer is so generous. I'm not just giving you a job, Elena. I'm giving you a chance to finally join the adult world, to start building something meaningful instead of wasting your time with government work that leads nowhere." Elena felt something cold and crystalline forming in her chest. Not anger, but a perfect clarity about what was happening. They weren't trying to help her, they were feeding off her supposed misery like emotional vampires. Each cutting comment, each patronizing suggestion, each piece of unsolicited advice was designed to elevate themselves while crushing her spirit. What made it particularly insidious was how they'd weaponized love and family loyalty to justify their cruelty. Every attack was wrapped in concern, every insult disguised as tough love. They were systematically destroying her dignity while convincing themselves they were performing an act of charity. As Elena looked around the circle of faces, all watching her with the expectant expressions of people waiting for a show, she realized they had made one critical error in their psychological warfare campaign. They assumed they understood her situation completely, but they were operating with information that was not just incomplete, but devastatingly wrong. The moment had arrived that Elena had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Fernando, sensing that he had successfully cornered his prey in front of the entire family audience, decided it was time to deliver the coup de grace. He straightened his Italian suit jacket and cleared his throat with the pompous authority of a man about to pronounce judgment on a lesser being. "Elena," Fernando announced, his voice carrying across the hushed ballroom like a judge delivering a verdict. "I think it's time we stopped dancing around the obvious. You've had your little adventure playing soldier, and now it's time to face reality. I'm offering you a lifeline here, a chance to finally start building something real, something meaningful." The family circle had grown to encompass nearly the entire reunion, with relatives craning their necks to witness what they sensed would be the climactic moment of the evening's entertainment. Elena could see the anticipation in their faces, the cruel satisfaction of people watching someone finally get what they believed she deserved. Isabella stepped forward, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she gestured toward Elena with theatrical concern. "Darling, we've all been patient with your phase, but refusing Fernando's generous offer would be more than just stubborn. It would be self-destructive. At your age, with your limited options, this might be your last chance to salvage something from the mess you've made of your life." The words hit Elena like physical blows, each one carefully calculated to strip away another layer of her dignity. But what made them particularly vicious was the coating of false concern, the way Isabella delivered devastating insults while maintaining the pretense of caring family advice. Carmen, never one to miss an opportunity to demonstrate her own wisdom, placed what she probably thought was a supportive hand on Elena's shoulder. "Elena, I say this with love, you're not getting any younger. Every month you spend in denial is another month of earning potential lost forever. Fernando is offering you a chance to finally grow up and join the adult world." Diego and Pablo flanked their father like enforcers, their expensive suits and smug expressions creating a wall of entitled superiority. Diego spoke with the condescending tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. "Elena, we get it, change is scary, but you can't keep living in this fantasy where good intentions pay the bills. Dad's company is your ticket to financial stability." Pablo nodded enthusiastically, his cryptocurrency a success apparently qualifying him as a life coach. "Exactly, and time's running out. In 5 years you'll be pushing 40 with no savings, no property, no retirement plan. Do you really want to be that person, the family member everyone pities at reunions?" Elena stood perfectly still as the verbal assault continued, each family member adding their own layer of psychological pressure. She could see other relatives nodding in agreement, their faces showing the satisfied expressions of people witnessing justice being served. In their minds, the family failure was finally being offered salvation, and her response would determine whether she was worthy of their continued patience. Uncle Eduardo, sensing the moment's gravity, decided to add his own wisdom to the chorus. "Elena, when I was your age, I made the smart choice to listen to people who knew more than I did. That's how I built my businesses, my wealth, my success. Pride goes before a fall, and you've been falling for 8 years now." Aunt Rosa nodded sagely, her voice carrying the weight of someone delivering a moral lesson. "We've all watched you struggle, Elena. It breaks our hearts to see you living like this when the solution is right in front of you. Fernando is practically family. Accepting his help isn't charity, it's smart." Fernando raised his hand for silence, clearly savoring his moment as the family patriarch dispensing justice. The ballroom fell quiet except for the soft tinkling of ice and crystal glasses and the distant sound of the country club's fountain outside. All eyes were on Elena, waiting for her response to what everyone clearly considered the final offer. "Elena," Fernando said, his voice now carrying the gravity of an ultimatum, "I'm going to be direct with you because someone needs to be. You're 34 years old with nothing to show for your life except some military decorations that don't pay rent. You're working a dead-end government job, living in a slum apartment, driving a car that's older than some of our grandchildren." He paused for effect, letting his words sink in while the family audience absorbed the brutal assessment. "I'm offering you one last chance to turn your life around. A real job, real money, real prospects for advancement, but I need to know right now, Are you finally ready to admit that your way isn't working and accept help from people who actually understand success? The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes fixed on her, waiting for her response. The family had successfully cornered her in the most public way possible, creating a scenario where any answer she gave would be interpreted as either grateful submission or delusional defiance. As Elena looked around the circle of expectant faces, relatives who had known her since childhood, who should have been celebrating her service and sacrifice, she realized they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had revealed their true nature, and there would be no going back to the pretense of family love and support. What they didn't know was that in exactly 47 minutes, their carefully constructed narrative would be obliterated by 5 simple words that would change everything. The silence stretched across the ballroom like a taut wire, 30 pairs of eyes boring into Elena as she stood at the center of what had become a public execution. Fernando's ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, and Elena could feel the weight of expectations pressing down on her shoulders. The family wanted their show, their moment of vindication, where the prodigal daughter finally admitted her failures and begged for salvation. Elena took a slow, deliberate breath, her military training automatically engaging as she assessed the tactical situation one final time. They had her surrounded, outnumbered, with no apparent escape route. In their minds, they had executed a perfect ambush, cornering her in front of the entire family, stripping away her dignity piece by piece, until surrender was her only option. But they had made one critical error in their psychological warfare campaign. They assumed they held all the cards. "Uncle Fernando," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom, despite its soft tone. "I appreciate your generous offer. Really, I do, and I can see that everyone here is very concerned about my future." A murmur of approval rippled through the gathered relatives. They interpreted her calm tone as the beginning of capitulation, the first sign that their coordinated assault had finally broken through her stubborn defenses. Fernando smiled with the satisfaction of a hunter who had successfully cornered his prey. "But I have to ask," Elena continued, her military bearing becoming more apparent as she straightened to her full height. "What exactly makes you think I need saving?" The question caught Fernando off guard. This wasn't the script he had expected. Elena was supposed to express gratitude, maybe shed a few tears of relief, and accept his magnanimous offer with humble appreciation. Instead, there was something in her tone, a quiet confidence that didn't match the narrative they had so carefully constructed. "Elena," Carmen interjected quickly, sensing the conversation veering off course. "We're not trying to be cruel, we're trying to help you face reality. Your current situation speaks for itself." "Does it?" Elena asked, her voice still calm but carrying a subtle edge that made several relatives shift uncomfortably. "And what reality is that, exactly? That I'm a failure, that I've wasted my life, that I'm desperately poor and need Uncle Fernando to rescue me from my own poor choices." Isabella's diamond bracelet clinked as she gestured dismissively. "Elena, darling, we can all see how you're living. The old car, the tiny apartment, the government job that barely pays minimum wage. We're not judging you, we're trying to help you improve your situation." Elena nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering Isabella's assessment. "You know, you're absolutely right about one thing. Appearances can be very deceiving. People often make assumptions based on what they can see, without considering what might be hidden beneath the surface." Fernando's confidence was beginning to waver slightly. There was something in Elena's demeanor that didn't match the broken, desperate woman they had been systematically humiliating for the past hour. She stood too straight, spoke too calmly, met their eyes too directly for someone who had just been utterly defeated. "Elena," Fernando said, his voice carrying a warning tone, "I hope you're not about to make the mistake of refusing my offer out of misplaced pride, because I can guarantee you, this opportunity won't come around again." "Oh, I'm not refusing anything," Elena replied, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I'm just curious about You've all spent this evening explaining to me how business works, how wealth is built, how success is measured, and I've listened very carefully to everything you've said. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the circle of faces surrounding her. But I have to wonder if you really understand success as well as you claim. Why haven't any of you bothered to ask what I actually do for work? Beyond the VA hospital, I mean. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of uncertainty through the gathered family. Uncle Eduardo frowned. Diego and Pablo exchanged confused glances, and even Fernando's smug expression faltered slightly. What do you mean? Carmen asked, though there was a new note of uncertainty in her voice. Elena's smile widened slightly. I mean, you've all made a lot of assumptions about my life, my finances, my prospects for the future. But assumptions can be dangerous things, especially when they're based on incomplete information. Fernando's face was beginning to show the first signs of genuine confusion. Elena, what are you talking about? We all know about your situation. You work at the VA hospital. You live in that small apartment. You drive that old car. There's nothing mysterious about any of it. No, Elena agreed quietly. There isn't anything mysterious about it. It's all perfectly logical, actually. You just haven't been asking the right questions. The ballroom had grown completely silent now, the earlier mood of cruel entertainment replaced by a growing sense of unease. Several relatives were beginning to look genuinely puzzled, as if sensing that something fundamental about their understanding of the situation was about to change. Elena reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, checking the time with deliberate casualness. Actually, you know what? This conversation is about to become very interesting. Because in about 15 minutes, someone is going to walk through those doors who will clarify a few things about my situation. Fernando's gold Rolex suddenly felt heavy on his wrist as a cold realization began to dawn that perhaps, just perhaps, they had misread the situation entirely. The ballroom's atmosphere had shifted dramatically in the span of just a few minutes. What had begun as Fernando's triumphant public humiliation of the family's failure was now crackling with an undercurrent of uncertainty that none of the relatives could quite understand. Elena's calm confidence was like a pebble thrown into their perfectly constructed narrative, sending ripples of doubt through their ranks. Fernando, sensing that he was losing control of the situation, decided to reassert his dominance through sheer force of personality. He straightened his Italian suit jacket and stepped closer to Elena, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had intimidated business rivals and family members for decades. Elena, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but it ends now, he declared, his words carrying across the silent ballroom like a judge's gavel. You can stand there with that mysterious smile, all you want, but we all know the truth. You're broke, you're desperate, and you need help. Stop trying to save face and accept reality. The gathered relatives nodded in agreement, their earlier confusion giving way to relief that Fernando was taking charge again. This was the script they understood, the successful patriarch putting a delusional family member back in her place. Diego and Pablo moved to flank their father, creating a wall of masculine authority designed to intimidate Elena back into submission. Dad's right, Diego announced, his voice filled with the entitled confidence of someone who had never been truly challenged. Elena, whatever you're trying to prove here, it's not working. We can all see through this act. You're embarrassing yourself. Pablo nodded enthusiastically, his cryptocurrency cess apparently qualifying him to deliver psychological assessments. Seriously, Elena, this whole mysterious confident thing you're doing, it's just making you look delusional. We're trying to help you, but you have to be willing to help yourself. Elena listened to their renewed assault with the patience of someone watching children throw tantrums. There was something almost amusing about how desperately they were clinging to their narrative, even as cracks began to appear in their certainty. She could see the doubt creeping into some of their eyes, the way certain relatives were starting to question whether they had all the facts. You know, Elena said quietly, her voice cutting through Fernando's bluster like a blade through silk, you're absolutely right about one thing. Games can be very revealing. They show us who people really are when they think they have all the power. Carmen, sensing that Elena was somehow gaining ground despite being outnumbered 30-1, decided to launch her own counterattack. Elena, I don't know what you think you're accomplishing with this performance, but you're making everyone uncomfortable. We're family, and families don't play mind games with each other. Mind games, Elena repeated, her eyebrows rising slightly. Is that what you call asking simple questions about assumptions? Because I haven't played any games at all. I've just been listening to all of you explain how success works, how business operates, how wealth is built. It's been very educational. Isabella's diamonds caught the light as she gestured impatiently. Elena, enough with the riddles. If you have something to say, just say. Otherwise, accept Fernando's generous offer and stop wasting everyone's time. Elena's smile widened slightly, and for the first time all evening, there was something almost predatory in her expression. Oh, I don't think I'm wasting anyone's time at all. In fact, I think the next few minutes are going to be the most educational part of everyone's evening. Fernando felt a cold prickle of unease run down his spine. There was something in Elena's tone, something in the way she carried herself, that reminded him uncomfortably of the most successful business rivals he'd faced over the years. The ones who smiled quietly while their opponents talked themselves into corners, then delivered devastating counterattacks when least expected. Elena, he said, his voice carrying a warning edge, I've been patient with you out of family loyalty, but my patience has limits. Either accept my offer or don't, but stop with these cryptic comments and mysterious hints. Cryptic? Elena asked, tilting her head slightly. I don't think I'm being cryptic at all. I think I'm being quite clear. You've all made assumptions about my life based on what you can see, my car, my apartment, my clothes, my job at the VA, and based on those assumptions, you've constructed an entire narrative about who I am and what I need. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the circle of increasingly uncomfortable faces. But what if your assumptions are wrong? What if the evidence you're using to judge my success is incomplete? What if there are things about my situation that you simply don't know? Uncle Eduardo shifted nervously, his earlier confidence evaporating. Elena, what are you trying to say? I'm not trying to say anything, Elena replied calmly. I'm stating a fact. You've all spent this evening lecturing me about business, about building wealth, about making smart financial decisions, but none of you have asked the most basic question a successful person would ask when evaluating someone else's situation, which Fernando demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. Elena's smile became almost radiant. You never asked how much I'm actually worth. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if Elena had just announced that gravity was optional, or that the sky was actually green. The family stared at her with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief, unable to process what she had just said, because in their world, poor people didn't talk about being worth anything. Failures didn't smile when discussing their net worth, and family disappointments certainly didn't stand in ballrooms full of successful relatives and ask questions that suggested they might know something about wealth that the rich people did. The silence stretched across the ballroom like a physical presence, 30 pairs of eyes staring at Elena as if she had just spoken in a foreign language. The question, you never asked how much I'm actually worth, hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Fernando's mouth opened slightly, then closed, as his brain struggled to process what he had just heard. Diego was the first to break the stunned quiet, his voice carrying a nervous laugh that echoed awkwardly in the vast space. Elena, what are you talking about? You work at a veterans hospital. How could you possibly be? I mean, what could you be worth? Elena's smile never wavered. That's an interesting question, Diego, and I appreciate you finally asking it, even if it took you all evening to get there. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling through it with the casual confidence of someone checking a weather app. Let's see. Today's closing number. Carmen stepped forward, her corporate instincts sensing danger in a way her personal prejudices had blinded her to earlier. Elena, whatever you're implying, this isn't the time or place for. Elena interrupted gently, her voice still calm but now carrying an edge of steel that made several relatives step back involuntarily. For honesty, for facts, for having an adult conversation about business and wealth, the same topics you've all been lecturing me about for the past hour. Pablo, his cryptocurrency confidence shaken but not yet destroyed, tried to regain control of the narrative. Look, Elena, even if you've got some savings or whatever, we're talking about real wealth here. Real business success, not just $2.3 billion, Elena said quietly. The words hit the assembled family like a physical blow. Uncle Eduardo actually stumbled backward. Aunt Rosa's hand flew to her chest as if she were having a heart attack. Fernando's face went completely white, his gold Rolex suddenly feeling like a cheap toy on his wrist. That's impossible, Fernando whispered, though his voice carried no conviction. You can't, there's no way. Elena nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his objection seriously. You're absolutely right to question it, Uncle Fernando. 2.3 billion is a lot of money. More than anyone in this room has ever seen. Certainly, more than all of you combined have ever earned. She paused, letting that sink in. But then again, you never asked about MedTech Solutions, did you? Carmen's face had gone ashy. As someone who worked in consulting, she knew exactly what MedTech Solutions was. The revolutionary medical technology company that had transformed emergency medicine worldwide. She'd read about them in Forbes, seen their CEO featured on the cover of Fortune magazine. You can't, the co-founder and primary shareholder, Elena, finished. Actually, I can be, and I am. Dr. James Mitchell, and I started the company with my military savings, $50,000 during my final deployment. We've since revolutionized battlefield medicine, emergency response protocols and aviation medical systems across 4 continents. Isabella's diamond bracelet suddenly looked like costume jewelry as she stared at Elena in shock. But you live in that tiny apartment. You drive that old car, you work at a government hospital. Elena's expression softened slightly, showing the first hint of genuine emotion she'd displayed all evening. Because those things matter to me, Isabella. The apartment keeps me grounded. The car runs perfectly and doesn't contribute to pointless status competition. And the VA work, her voice grew stronger. The VA work connects me to the people I served with, the people I built my company to help. Fernando found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. The Emirates Airlines contract that was announced this week, $500 million. 500 million, Elena confirmed. Not bad for someone who supposedly doesn't understand how business works, wouldn't you? The family stood frozen, their entire worldview crumbling around them like a house of cards in an earthquake. Everything they thought they knew, every assumption they had made, every cruel word they had spoken, all of it was being systematically destroyed by the quiet woman they had spent the evening treating like a charity case. Carmen, her corporate mind finally catching up to the magnitude of the situation, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. You're one of the richest people in the country, in the world. Technically, yes, Elena replied though I prefer to think of myself as someone who found a way to use my military medical training to solve problems that save lives. The money is just a byproduct of creating something useful. Diego's earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning horror of someone realizing they had just insulted a person who could buy and sell their father's entire business empire without noticing the expense. We didn't know. No, Elena agreed, her voice gentle but implacable. You didn't know, because you never asked. You saw the surface, the car, the apartment, the simple clothes, and you assumed you understood everything. You confused appearance with reality, status symbols with actual success. She looked around the circle of shocked faces, her expression almost sympathetic. The ironic thing is, every one of you spent tonight lecturing me about business, about building wealth, about understanding how success works, but none of you recognized actual success when it was standing right in front of you. The ballroom had become a mausoleum of shattered egos and destroyed assumptions, with Elena standing calmly at the center like the eye of a hurricane that had just devastated everything in its path. The sound of heels clicking on marble echoed through the stunned silence of the ballroom as a woman in an elegant navy suit approached the frozen tableau. She moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention in boardrooms around the world. Her silver hair pulled back in a sophisticated chignon, her presence radiating the kind of authority that came from running a billion-dollar consulting empire. Carmen's face went from ashen to completely white as she recognized the approaching figure. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That's Margaret Chen. Margaret Chen, the legendary CEO of Chen Global Consulting, the woman whose firm handled international mergers worth hundreds of billions of dollars, whose client list read like a who's who of Fortune 500. Carmen had only seen her from across crowded conference rooms at industry events, never dreaming she would ever be in the same space as business royalty of this caliber. "Elena," Margaret called out warmly, her voice carrying easily across the ballroom. "There you are. I'm so sorry I'm late. The flight from Singapore was delayed, and traffic from the airport was absolutely brutal." The family watched in mounting horror as Margaret Chen walked directly toward Elena with the familiar ease of a close friend. Several relatives actually stepped back involuntarily, as if being in proximity to such concentrated power and wealth might somehow contaminate them with their evening's behavior. Elena's face lit up with genuine pleasure as she embraced Margaret. "Margaret, I wasn't sure you'd make it. How was the Kawasaki Industries merger?" "Exhausting but successful," Margaret replied, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Though I have to say, after spending 3 weeks negotiating with Japanese executives, a family reunion sounds absolutely relaxing by comparison." Carmen felt her knees go weak. The Kawasaki Industries merger had been front-page news in the Financial Times, a $43 billion deal that had reshaped the global automotive industry. And Elena was asking about it like she was inquiring about someone's vacation. Margaret's keen eyes swept across the circle of frozen family members, taking in their shocked expressions and uncomfortable body language, with the trained instinct of someone who had spent decades reading rooms full of powerful people. "Elena, darling, please tell me you haven't been keeping your success a secret from your family all this time." The question landed like a precision-guided missile in the middle of an already devastated battlefield. Fernando felt his knees buckle slightly as the implications crashed over him like a tsunami. If Margaret Chen was talking about Elena's success as if it were common knowledge, actually, Elena said with a slight smile, "We were just having that conversation. My family has been very educational tonight. They've taught me a lot about assumptions and appearances." Margaret's eyebrows rose as she took in the scene more carefully, the family's shell-shocked expressions, Elena's calm composure, the obvious tension crackling through the air. As someone who had spent her career navigating corporate politics and power dynamics, she could read the situation immediately. "Oh dear," Margaret said softly, though her voice carried clearly across the silent ballroom. "Please don't tell me they didn't know about MedTech Solutions." Pablo made a sound, somewhere between a whimper and a gasp. Isabella actually swayed on her feet, her diamond jewelry suddenly looking as substantial as soap bubbles. Uncle Eduardo was staring at Margaret Chen as if she were a mythical creature that had just materialized in front of him. "You know about MedTech?" Carmen managed to croak, though she already knew the answer. Margaret looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Know about it? My dear, Elena's company has revolutionized emergency medical protocols for half my clients' international operations. The aviation medical systems alone have saved thousands of lives. MedTech Solutions is one of the most innovative companies in the world." She turned to Elena with obvious pride. "Elena, you didn't tell me you were being modest with your family. The Qatar Airways contract we discussed last month. That's another 600 million, isn't it? Combined with the Emirates deal, you're looking at over $1 billion just in aviation contracts this year." Fernando's gold Rolex felt like it was burning his wrist. Over $1 billion aviation contracts alone, from one person, the woman he had been offering a $35,000 administrative assistant position to, had closed deals worth more money than his entire family had seen in their collective lifetime. Margaret continued, oblivious to the psychological carnage she was inflicting on Elena's relatives. "And I heard from James Mitchell that the Pentagon is interested in your new trauma response systems. Military contracts are so complex, but if anyone can navigate that bureaucracy, it's you. Your background gives you such a unique advantage in that market." Carmen felt like she was drowning in a sea of incomprehension. Pentagon contracts, billion-dollar aviation deal. Margaret Chen, talking about Elena like she was a peer, a colleague, an equal in the rarefied atmosphere of international business at its highest levels. "Margaret," Elena said gently, "I think my family, is still processing some information. Perhaps we should. Margaret's eyes widened with understanding and no small amount of embarrassment. Elena, I'm so sorry. I had no idea they were just learning about your success. How terribly awkward for everyone. She looked around the circle of stunned faces with something approaching sympathy. Well, I suppose introductions are in order. I'm Margaret Chen, CEO of Chen Global Consulting. Elena and I have been friends for several years now. We met when my firm was consulting on the international expansion of medtech solutions. The silence that followed was so complete that the distant sound of the country club's fountain seemed to echo like thunder in the ballroom. The thunderous silence that followed Margaret's introduction stretched across the ballroom like the aftermath of an explosion. 30 family members stood frozen in various stages of shock, their faces displaying expressions ranging from disbelief to horror, to dawning comprehension of the magnitude of their evening's behavior. Fernando was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Elena, he stopped, his throat closing as the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. He had offered a billionaire a $35,000 administrative assistant position. He had lectured one of the world's most successful entrepreneurs about building wealth. He had publicly humiliated someone who could buy his entire real estate empire with pocket change. Margaret, sensing the family's distress with the diplomatic skills that had made her one of the world's most successful consultants, stepped smoothly into the breach. Elena, perhaps I should explain to your family exactly what you've accomplished. Sometimes we forget that not everyone follows the international business news as closely as we do. She turned to address the gathered relatives with the same professional courtesy she showed to heads of state and Fortune 500 CEOs. MedTech Solutions, which Elena co-founded, is currently valued at approximately $12 billion. Elena's stake makes her one of the youngest billionaires in North America, and certainly one of the most influential figures in emergency medical technology worldwide. Isabella's diamond necklace suddenly felt like a child's costume jewelry around her neck. Carmen's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her corporate vocabulary completely deserting her. Diego and Pablo looked like they were witnessing the end of the world, which in a sense they were. Their world of assumed superiority and inherited arrogance was crumbling around them in real time. But more than that, Margaret continued, her voice warming with genuine admiration, Elena has revolutionized how we think about emergency medical care. Her portable surgical units have saved lives in earthquake zones, conflict areas, and remote regions where traditional medical infrastructure doesn't exist. The aviation medical systems her company developed have reduced in-flight medical emergencies by 60% globally. Uncle Eduardo made a sound like air escaping from a deflated balloon. The woman they had been pitying, the family member they had been trying to save from her own poor choices, had literally saved thousands of lives while building a business empire that dwarfed anything any of them had ever dreamed of achieving. Margaret's keen business instincts picked up on the family's obvious distress, and her expression shifted to something approaching concern. Elena, I hope you don't mind me asking, but your family seems surprised by this information. Have you been keeping your success private? Elena's smile was gentle but carried an edge that those who knew her well would recognize as dangerous. Not private, exactly, just modest. My family has very strong opinions about success, and I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable by contradicting their assumption. The words landed like individual daggers in the hearts of every relative present. They had spent the evening systematically destroying Elena's dignity while she had stood there, worth more than all of them combined, listening to their lectures about building wealth and understanding business. Carmen finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. Elena, when we were talking about your situation, you mean when you were explaining to me how business works? Elena asked pleasantly. How I needed to grow up and join the adult world. Yes, I remember that conversation very clearly. Fernando felt like he was drowning in shame and humiliation. Every word he had spoken, every condescending comment, every piece of unsolicited advice, all of it had been delivered to someone who had achieved more success than he could comprehend. He had positioned himself as the successful patriarch offering wisdom to a failed family member, when in reality he had been a small-time property manager lecturing a global business titan. Margaret, beginning to understand the full scope of what had transpired, looked around the circle of mortified faces, with something approaching pity. "Oh dear, I'm beginning to see what happened here. You assumed that because Elena lives modestly and works with veterans, she must be struggling financially. We offered her a job," Diego said numbly, his voice hollow with the realization of his mistake. "Dad offered her an administrative assistant position for $35,000. The silence that followed this admission was so profound that it seemed to have physical weight. Margaret's eyebrows rose infinitesimally, the only sign of her surprise at hearing that someone had offered one of the world's most successful entrepreneurs an entry-level clerical position. "How generous," Margaret said carefully, her diplomatic training preventing her from expressing what she was actually thinking. Elena looked around the circle of devastated faces, family members who had spent the evening competing to deliver the most cutting observations about her life choices, who had positioned themselves as her superiors offering charity to an inferior. The irony was so complete, so perfect, that it almost felt scripted. "You know," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, "this evening has been very enlightening. I've learned a lot about assumptions about family, and about the difference between success and the appearance of success." She paused, letting her gaze rest on each shocked face in turn. "I've also learned that sometimes the people who talk the most about wealth and business are the ones who understand it the least." The family stood in the wreckage of their shattered assumptions, finally understanding that they had just humiliated themselves in the most spectacular way possible. The weight of Elena's final words settled over the ballroom like a shroud, but she wasn't finished. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small worn photograph, the same crayon drawing from her daughter that she'd mentioned earlier, now carefully preserved in a protective sleeve. "You know what's interesting?" Elena said, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. "My 6-year-old niece Emma drew this for me last month when I visited her school's career day. She wrote 'My Aunt Elena saves people' in those wobbly letters." She held up the drawing so everyone could see the stick figure in military fatigues standing next to what looked like a hospital. "She didn't care about my car or my apartment or my clothes. She only cared about what I did for others. A child understood what all of you missed." Margaret watched with growing admiration as Elena transformed what could have been a moment of cruel triumph into something much more profound. "Fernando," Elena continued, turning to her uncle whose face had gone completely gray, "you asked me what I had to show for my life. The answer isn't the $2.3 billion, though that number seems to impress everyone. It's the 8047 soldiers I treated in field hospitals who made it home to their families. It's the 12,000 veterans I've helped through my foundation's PTSD program. It's the earthquake victims in Haiti who survived because our portable surgical units reached them in time." Fernando's knees finally gave out, and he sank into a nearby chair, his gold Rolex catching the light as his hands trembled. "Carmen," Elena's gaze moved to her sister whose makeup was now streaked with tears. "You said I needed to join the adult world, but I've been living in the adult world while you've been playing status game. Real success isn't about what you own, it's about what you build, what you create, what you leave behind." Elena walked slowly around the circle, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Uncle Eduardo, you talked about pride going before a fall, but the only fall I've witnessed tonight is the collapse of a family's capacity for basic human decency. You turned what should have been a celebration into a public execution, and the only crime was your assumption that worth is measured by what someone wears." The relatives stood frozen, many now openly weeping as they realized the true magnitude of what they had done. They hadn't just misjudged Elena's financial situation, they had revealed the ugliness that lived in their own heart. Margaret stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in boardrooms with the world's most powerful people. "If I may," she said gently, "I've worked with royalty, presidents and billionaires around the world. I've seen people with enormous wealth and people with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and I can tell you that Elena Rodriguez is one of the most remarkable human beings I've ever met, not because of her money, but because of her character." Elena smiled at her friend, then turned back to her family one final time. I want you all to understand something. I didn't reveal my success tonight to humiliate you, though I understand that's what happened. I revealed it to teach you the same lesson I learned in a foxhole in Afghanistan when a 19-year-old soldier shared his last meal with me even though he thought I outranked him. She paused, letting the silence stretch. True wealth isn't what you have, it's what you give. True success isn't what you achieve for yourself, it's what you do for others. And true family isn't about blood or shared DNA, it's about love, support, and lifting each other up instead of tearing each other down. Diego finally found his voice, though it came out broken. Elena, we're so sorry, we didn't know. You didn't know because you never asked. Elena replied, not unkindly, but more importantly, it shouldn't have mattered. Whether I was worth $2 or $2 billion, I deserved your respect as a human being, as a veteran, and as family. Elena began walking toward the ballroom's exit, then turned back one final time. The reunion is at the same place next year. Maybe by then you'll have learned to measure success by kindness instead of possession. Until then, I have a foundation dinner to attend. We're announcing a $100 million initiative to build mobile hospitals in underserved communities. As Elena and Margaret walked away, their heels clicking on the marble floor, the family remained frozen in the wreckage of their assumptions and their shame. The last thing they heard was Elena's voice carrying back to them like an echo. Real success whispers while insecurity shouts. Remember that. And in that moment, 30 people learned that the most expensive education in the world sometimes comes for free, when you discover that the person you looked down on was actually looking down at you from heights you never dreamed possible, but chose to remain humble anyway. The true lesson wasn't about money, it was about recognizing that every person carries invisible victories, hidden struggles, and untold worth that can't be measured by what meets the eye. Sometimes the most successful people are the ones who don't need to prove it, and the most failed are those who spend their lives trying to.
You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.